as I mentioned, we're going to talk a bit from the inside out, and I'm going to try not to repeat things that I think Ranjini really talked a good bit about the process and things. So let's go ahead and move to the first slide, Corinna. Just a little bit high level. Of course, I think goes without saying that we're all here to protect the research record. The integrity of the research record is really important. We all care about it. We all have a role in doing that. But the institutional side, certainly there's more to it than that. We are, correcting the scientific literature is one piece of what the institutional responsibilities are when we look at dealing with other things that come up during the course of an investigation. Also, one of the topics that we just talked about, QRPs, the questionable research practices. Not everything fits nicely into the research misconduct bucket, but the institution has to look at protecting the whole integrity of the research environment. And that includes the people involved, it includes the scientific record, but it's not just about the one piece of getting a publication corrected, while we all recognize that that's a real critical point. From an institutional perspective, and speaking from the US perspective, obviously we're governed by various regulatory agencies, HHS ORI being one of the big funders of research, so clearly one of our big partners in this, but also NSF, DOD, whatever funding, sometimes foundational funding, et cetera. So there's many different regulatory agencies that the institutions work under the auspices for managing research integrity, and in particular research misconduct. And the institutions have to build their policy around all of those regulatory frameworks and figure out what's going to work best there. So each institution has their own policy for dealing with this, and they also have a dedicated research integrity officer, at least in the US. So we're going to be speaking from that perspective today. I think Ranjini already, very nicely highlighted the overview of the process overall with the assessment, inquiry, and investigation committees, as well as there's an institutional decision related to whether or not there's research misconduct. And specifically, I guess everyone probably assumes here, I'm talking about FFP when we talk about research misconduct, although some institutions, Northwestern included, does have other questionable research practices, sometimes included in, or other serious deviations is the term that we use. And that could be part of the definition for institutional research misconduct. But I'm going to really try and focus on the FFP piece here. But as highlighted by the process overview, we have multiple faculty committees. I think Ranjini mentioned this as well. We have scientists who are looking at this, and this is a really a process dictated by the regulations that the institutions carry out. One piece I don't think we touched on before is the idea that institutions, in terms of making a finding of research misconduct, have to find intent. That's also part of what ORI does as well, but we have to determine who committed the misconduct, and we have to determine that it was intentional, knowing, or reckless. Those are part of the standards in the regulation. So false data, wherever that is, if it sits in a research paper or what have you, doesn't equal research misconduct. And I know we kind of touched a little bit on that in Jennifer's presentation as well. But so those are all pieces related to the institutional process. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just touching on a few real complicated issues that come up during the course of institutional investigations. The idea of whether or not allegations are brought forward in good faith. I've been a research integrity officer and involved in this for, over, I think, 15, 18 years at Northwestern. And, you see lots of things. I think that, we can all, deciding whether something's brought forward in good faith is really difficult to judge sometimes. But, when we see a student who's, kicked out of a graduate program for not making progress on their degree, and then the next week they bring research misconduct allegations against all three of their former investigators that they worked with, we start to wonder what's going on. But from an institutional perspective, it doesn't matter. We have to look at everything. If there's specific and credible evidence, we take it seriously, regardless of how it comes to our office. And it comes in many different forms. It comes in anonymously, it comes in, with people internal, external, et cetera. So, but we do have to navigate these things very carefully. In particular, the idea, and I don't want to even belabor it, but I'd be remiss not to mention the power differentials that exist in research, right? When you have graduate students, postdocs, faculty members, there's just, you know, a grad student bringing concerns against their PI represents a different situation, and we have to handle it differently versus a PI who finds a grad student who falsified a figure. Those are handled really in very different ways, at least from our perspective at the institutional level. We have to think about protecting people from retaliation, and not just the whistleblowers, but anybody that might be in a lab. If we have allegations related to the principal investigator, or sometimes, you know, even within colleagues, we've also seen research misconduct allegations used as a weapon. So colleagues that are feuding and, you know, raising allegations of research misconduct against each other. So those are all things that the institution has to navigate when they're dealing with the allegations and trying to review them appropriately, thoroughly. You know, in particular, research misconduct does not include things like honest error or scientific difference of opinions. So we have to look at these perspectives when we're evaluating this. The confidentiality standards, I think, understanding from the inside how important they are. We know that even just the nature of saying, you know, someone's accused of research misconduct automatically carries a stigma with it. So thinking about confidentiality, but I think those same confidentiality standards also sometimes create frustration that there isn't more transparency about what's happening. So I think that, you know, understanding that these are challenges that the institution has to face when we're dealing with this, and we have to make sure that confidentiality is protected at every level, not just the person who's bringing forward concerns, the person who's accused, all parties involved. We really operate on a need-to-know basis for many reasons, because we also want to protect the integrity of the investigation, but in particular, protect the reputation for anyone who's involved, the witnesses, the respondents, the whistleblowers, et cetera. Let's move on to the next one, Corinna, please. Okay, I want to touch briefly, thinking about the framework that we operate on at the institutional level. I'm going to touch on some procedural challenges and other issues and challenges that we face. And then Corinna, I think, is going to highlight some of that with the examples that she's going to share with us. So Ranjini also mentioned earlier the issue of sequestration. And I know I saw even in the chat, people were talking about, like, do you get the raw data or not? And this is really so critical that the institution have a way to sequester the evidence that's needed to facilitate our review, as well as any review that might come later by a regulatory oversight agency. Timing is critical. The regulations require that we sequester everything at the time of or prior to notifying someone who's accused. So if we can't get there first, how can we ensure the integrity of the data that we're collecting? So I think the timing is a really critical thing. But then when we start thinking about the tools and such that institutions need, the increased sophistication and the volume of data you know, that we're collecting, and the ability to try and make sense of that, use that, screen that, that's certainly where tools are needed, because the volume keeps getting bigger and, you know, things keep getting more complicated. So another thing, you know, is the related to the timeframes. I think from a procedural perspective, everyone thinks, you know, institutions take too long. I mean, we heard our partner this morning, Ranjini, acknowledge like that the investigations don't happen in 120 days. I think we're already set up with unrealistic timeframes. These investigations do take a long time because of the things that the institutions have to deal with. And, you know, I'm going to try and highlight some of those challenges, and we'll talk about, you know, how maybe some tools can help us facilitate the process where we can make, you know, efficiencies and improvements. Talking about a bit about, you know, the whistleblowers, that sometimes also affects the time frame. You know, as I mentioned, having a grad student raise concerns about their mentor, their investigator, it doesn't exactly allow you the opportunity for that grad student to go back to work in the lab the next day after they've raised concerns. So it's not uncommon for the institutions to have to put protections in place for parties before we can even move forward with dealing with the investigation or notifying a respondent, because we need to protect parties who are involved. I think that I mentioned already the issue related to confidentiality standards and expectations. I think that, this certainly affects things related to when institutions share information outside of the institution, in particular with journals and other things. And I think that I'll touch on that a little bit later, but the regulations really require very strict confidentiality standards. We all care about correcting the record, but oftentimes we have to be in the right place where the institution feels confident that they can and should share information that's important for others to know. I did mention prior that we have to determine intent. So it's not just about, okay, we have false image. This gets very complicated. We have papers that often have many co-authors, many other institutions, trying to figure out who's responsible. Often this goes back to some of the pieces related to sequestration, but when you have other authors involved in other institutions, how that gets managed at the institutional level, collaborating potentially with other research integrity officers, or trying to collect the information to even figure out who is potentially responsible could be and is often a challenge for institutions. Sometimes it's a big web of things that the institution has to untangle and try and figure out who did what piece, who's responsible here, who's potentially responsible, who had oversight, who even has the data. That's something that we have to figure out with each case. And lastly here, from a procedural perspective, the issues that come up when respondents leave. Frequently, respondents, faculty in particular, but also postdocs and staff, when they're being investigated, it's not uncommon for them to leave during the course of the investigation. I already mentioned these investigations frequently, I would say on average, might take anywhere from 1 to 2 years to play out at the institution, and to go through kind of the whole process. And someone leaves during that course. So now they're down the street at, the other university, or they've moved on to somewhere else. And so what happens? How do institutions communicate with the other institution? What happens when they move there? What things are appropriate to be communicated? And all of that gets very tricky for institutions to navigate. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. And with that, I want to just touch on a few kind of higher level issues that also affect and create challenges at the institutional level. So one of the things that came up, I think, before with one of the other comments was the idea of, that ORI doesn't, make findings on things. I think that it is not, from an institutional perspective, we handle a lot more than what actually results in ORI findings. And I think, we see that even in ORI's data with the number of cases that get reported to them, many of which will have findings at the institutional level, but for whatever reason, ORI determines that they don't need to pursue findings, or they can't pursue findings. Either, could be that something like sequestration was jeopardized for whatever reason, or, the ORI can also determine that the institution and the institution's done what they needed to do, and the respondent isn't a threat to future federal funding. And there's many different reasons why ORI declines to pursue findings. But I think that the lack of federal findings often leaves institutions kind of hanging out there, saying, well, we have to do what we need to do. We're dealing with things that go beyond that, even other things that don't fall into the FFP category. But regardless, as I mentioned, the institutions have to protect the whole, environment, the whole research community. So it's not just, okay, we're dealing with false images there. We go beyond that. The increasing litigious nature of cases, I think, is probably nothing that would surprise anyone here. That certainly adds to the time frame of things, but it also complicates things. It also complicates federal findings as well. So we have, kind of increasing respondents who are more litigious, who want to kind of fight about the process, et cetera. And that causes real complications for the institution to deal with. And, as a result of all of this, when you look at really research on research integrity, a lot of what we see is research on the public information. As I mentioned, there's a lot of confidentiality standards. Institutions don't want to put on their website, we had, 20 findings of research misconduct last year. However, the data, we know that what ORI makes findings on is really a small fraction of what institutions are dealing with and having findings on. So I do think that the lack of research on, real data, and for many reasons, because, we don't really even have that level of transparency yet, creates a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of what is actually happening, who commits misconduct, what misconduct is committed. Frequently, I would say, we see the pieces with ORI, that there's, they have very clear evidence. Those are the ones that they know they can pursue. But, it also is likely not the ones who are very litigious. So, the faculty member who hires, a great legal team and is fighting these things, and maybe we didn't have the most pristine, evidence, could cause a lack of federal finding, whereas, the idea would be, there's all these, it's mostly predominantly junior people who commit misconduct. I can tell you, we did a retrospective review of the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, and 2 to 1, we had faculty who were the respondents. And I think it was maybe more than 10 to 1, we had faculty as the complainants. I think there's inherently a misperception about who is even reporting research misconduct, because we're not at a place where we have that information readily available. And the information that we are making these conclusions on is really based on a very, very small, discrete portion of things. And I say that to kind of remind us that when we're looking at this, I think we have to think about what's really happening at the institutional level, so that we can think about how we address that through tools and other things. Anonymous complaints are something that causes lots of issues for institutions. When we get an anonymous complaint, we handle it exactly the same as anything else. However, we frequently don't have the same back and forth and cooperation that we need to get all the information. If someone sends me an email that's incomplete and doesn't respond, it really makes it difficult for us to go and resolve that. And with that, the idea of the institutions, I mentioned the confidentiality standards, communications with journals are something, personally, I think we have to look at where we can have inroads to have better cooperation. How do journals communicate with institutions, and then the same back? We heard before about, people requesting changes. We've sent requests to journals where we've never even gotten a response back. So, institutions may find that something's not true, false, et cetera. And, when we communicate with journals and there isn't a better process, institutions are left without any way to deal with that. And lastly, I'm just going to touch briefly on, thinking about things like sequestration and confidentiality. The increasing public nature of complaints really compromises the integrity of investigations at institutions. When something plays out in the blogosphere and we aren't able to sequester the right evidence in a timely fashion, we can forget about any kind of federal findings as well. So there's a lot of different challenges that the institution faces. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corinna, who's going to maybe provide some nice examples and better visualization of those challenges.
Okay, thank you.
Corinna, now you
I wasn't allowed to unmute.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So yes, as you can see from what Lauran just mentioned, there are many topics we could have followed through. We decided to keep it short and simple. A few examples of items that we think the community needs to know and that we really need to get on the same page on. The first thing that we know is that by doing research misconduct investigations, we know that the research misconduct is the allegations that we review are many and different. And they're not just images that you can spot on a paper. The majority actually, they are not. And so there's a ton of work that is done at the institutional level on trying to figure out all the rest. This is an example. We realized as Northwestern that the trend of what we were seeing out there in the literature wasn't exactly what we were seeing in our institution. So we surveyed a number of others, 5. And we came up with a sort of average. I mean, it's not the best representation, but just to give you an idea of, on average, of what people see. The majority do not involve images. There was an institution that had almost 100% of falsified images easy to spot. That wasn't the same for all the others. So majority does not, on average, involve images. Of the ones that involve images, the majority are not easy to spot. So unless you have some inner knowledge of what happened, unless you know and you have sequestered material, then it's really hard for us to determine whatever happened, if anything happened there. However, as I said before, the majority of the literature seems to focus and of the common discussion out there seems to focus on images that are easy to spot. And don't get me wrong, there's work to be done there too, but we need help on the rest as well. So first take-home message is that research misconduct does not equal to falsified images that are easy to spot, period. Like there's no middle ground there. Institutions are not just working on what you can spot by looking at images. And the majority of what you do actually does not involve those kind of things. I then decided to put together 4 examples. I need to thank Julia Banfield from the University of Michigan, because she provided me the Western blots that I falsified. However, the examples I'm going to talk about are things that in the community had happened. I'm not going to say happened to Northwestern, or maybe yes, but some of them are, all of them are things that happen in our world. So there's a blog or there's some sort of journal out there that says that Professor X falsified an image, or a sort of that, like, oh, another attraction for Professor X, or and the lab of Professor X as another, expression of concern, or another image that is falsified. We look at the image and we see that actually there's something that is a little bit sketchy here. As you can see, there's a splice. It's really visible. There are 2 different plots, most probably, with different backgrounds that were put together. When talking with the PI, the first thing that he says is that the plots were only meant to show that the protein was expressed in those samples. I wasn't meaning to say anything more. So since our job is first to sequester, we have a first scenario in which this is exactly what happened. We go and we sequester. While we sequester, we found a number of files in the server folder of Professor X. One of the files is figure X that appears to be corrupted. Then there's gel 1 and the gel 2. By looking at them, we realized that gel 1 and gel 2 are most probably the one that created the figures. We're sure about it. So we ask about that to Professor X, and he says, well, I'm so sorry. The original gels are there. I'm sorry the file with all the full experimental details is corrupted. I frankly can't remember who made those experiments. It was years ago. Very good. Now, let's try to imagine a different world. One in which, for instance, the blogger, instead of publishing the concern, comes to us first. In that case, we might have a different outcome. Something like we sequester the folders and we find another subfolder relative to abuser B, where we can find the gel 1, gel 2, and we also find the Photoshop, where the 2 gels were put together. And each one of them has some sort of weird name. Each one of the layers that were used has a weird name, AXT87, GAP 789. So we start to look a little bit further and we try to figure out where these layers come from. By looking further, we find a number of other images that were slightly modified, more or less nudged, not nudged, changed, and everything that happened to those files, creation, all the metadata show modification by the abuser B. Now, why this is important? Did Professor X actually falsify the image? Was the first claim correct? Was it research misconduct? Maybe. Who was responsible? Maybe in first instance, at least for the falsification itself, maybe it wasn't Professor X, or maybe it was, and I don't know, create another. What underlying problem there might be? And I think that this is something that we often forget when we try to clean the literature and not understand that we need to figure out the underlying problems. And why do we? When committees meet and are charged to try to understand if research misconduct was committed, there's a part that is extremely important and is the trying to figure out why a certain action took place. Was it the lab environment? Was it how the department is managed? Was it a one-off kind of thing? And the reason why that is extremely important is because that's the only way how we can go to the root of the problem and try to provide mentorship to that laboratory or change things as how data are saved. There are so many actions that institutions can take internally to fix and to help certain issues that unless we know what actually happened, we would never be able to do. So in case one, we would have never gotten to a full understanding of what has happened there. Now, example B, this is a published figure. We fortunately have an internal anonymous complaint that says, the lab of Professor J never measured that sample. We look at the figure. The size of the bands is a bit weird, but the background is decent. It seems more or less the same. So we go back, as always, to what was sequestered. By looking at what was sequestered, we try to figure out within the sequestered materials if we can find those images. And we are lucky enough that at a certain stage, we can find a folder with all the Western blots and we can identify which one it is. In doing so, though, we realize, we open the file, we realize where the sample and control come from, and then we realize they're actually both controls. So the sample was actually never measured. The reason why I bring this example is because you cannot always spot image manipulation. And misidentification of bands is something that actually happens pretty often. Third example. So we have a published image, another one, and we look at it. We have a complainant that said, hey, I work in that lab. In that case, we actually know the person. I remember that same graph from a lab meeting, but the control was really bad. I don't think it was, I don't know what happened there, but there's something weird. We go back, as always. We look and we find the Photoshop where there's a number of layers of one specific piece that are called layer A, copy 1, copy 2, copy 3, copy 4. So we try to look at what happened. And we realized that actually this band was duplicated 4 times. Changed, snatched, etc. And this is to say, we need help here because identifying what happened to an image, unless you really find a file like that, that gives you an idea, is really not easy. And so this is something that I hope the community will be able to help us on. Here is the first example I feel very strongly about, and it is standards. So a journal reaches out to authors, not to us, and says, we need the raw data, papers from the 20 years ago. The second and the fifth band in an image are the same. As evidence to bring a visual comparison and a similar gradient mapping. Now, a gradient mapping, what does is recolorize a certain band in order to show certain features. However, the use of a gradient map can enhance certain features, but also hide others. So a gradient map by itself is not necessarily good enough to tell you those two things are exactly the same. So what we did was add in this case, by putting the two images one in front of the other, by using another ORI action, we figured out that actually the two bands weren't the same. So if in this community, we try to present ourselves as gatekeepers of the truth of science, of real data, of what is true and what is not, what you can trust and what you can't, then we really need to work harder to figure out ways to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards. If we can use one technique more to prove that two things are the same, let's do that. If we can find another way to even be more precise in determining if a manipulation happened, well, then we should really work on that. We were asked for a list. The list is actually huge. We defined a few small items that are important and that are very low-hanging fruits. But and the first one is that HHS RI actions and gradients, like all the overlays, etc., they are like on just for Photoshop. Let's make them for Image or anything that is free so that we can actually use them, all of us. Image duplication tools do exist. They do not yet work as well as they should. And I really hope that we will work really hard on finding algorithms to find splices, differences in resolution, backgrounds, and use of more sophisticated Photoshop tools, because there are many. Quantification of similarity is a very difficult mathematical problem. We understand that. However, if there's anyone that can solve it, that's the research community. And we really hope you will tackle this. Sequestration, we need help trying to figure out ways to filter through terabytes of data, because we are not any longer handling, the USB stick. We are handling terabytes of data, and we need to figure out if a certain string, a certain number is, in a certain, in which files it is, so that we can figure out what happened to that specific number, to that specific data. In general, our community is has a ton of restrictions when it comes to confidentiality, but this doesn't mean that we cannot talk. We will not share confidential matters. We will not tell you the cases we're dealing with or the cases we dealt with, but we can speak hypotheticals and we can speak about things, general things that happens. We can gather data. And I think there is a need for the people that do the work feet on the ground to communicate with researchers and with anyone who spends their time looking at things and trying to figure out issues, so that we can be together and we can look at this together. Lauran?
So hopefully the things that Corinna and I shared with you highlight some of the challenges that institutions face at a big picture level, hopefully framing the process and the procedural challenges, because there are many places throughout the process where we believe that we could work together to find better efficiencies and create tools that will be useful for everyone. I think it's really important to remember that from an institutional responsibility related to research misconduct, it's more than just identifying false data or duplicated images. That's really just a portion of what we're doing. And I think that, while we agree that there's tools needed related to that, we really need tools that go beyond that help us facilitate spotting and addressing research misconduct as a whole. The quick and dirty little survey that Corinna did just to show, is it just Northwestern? Is it others? I mean, we don't have real scientific data on it, but from research integrity officers talking amongst ourselves, we know that the spotted images are a real small fraction of the research misconduct that we deal with. So, and Ranjini did a great job of highlighting some of those other things, and we saw some of that in Jennifer's work as well, because we all really have the same goal. We all care about protecting science. We care about the integrity of the scientific record, but as Corinna was ending, and I think as we both want to end, is that we really think that there's a lot of opportunities for cooperation, increased and open communication, but most importantly, trust, because all of us have a different role to play, but I think it's within working together that we can try and get better results and help each other there. So with that, we want to have a couple of thanks, Corinna. The Association of Research Integrity Officers is really a valuable community for us where we share these ideas and really have a great resource in terms of experience and knowledgeable people. And
the shout out goes to Julia, mostly to the group with whom I've had the honor to discuss all these things with for the past few years, and Julia that allowed me to have blots to falsify, which was an interesting experience by itself.
Thank you.